That's difficult to answer at this stage. There's two different facets to it. I think at the moment a lot of the debate has been in Parliament. Everything from the way the opposition, the Labour Party, has managed to try and get focus on key debates and force the government to bring information to Parliament. The way that select committees are operating at the moment in terms of dealing with Brexit suggests that they're feeling quite empowered. There are different aspects though about the legislative process. There is a big debate to be had in Parliament that's already going on about certain kinds of legislation, what we call secondary legislation, where the process of Brexit could give our executive, the government, more powers to just do things without having to go through a long parliamentary process. And that's something that's up for debate at the moment. It's something that will be debated in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. I think it's something that parliamentarians are very aware of at the moment. I think the government is very aware of and wary that it doesn't want to overstep the mark. So it's something to watch in the coming months and indeed years as Brexit plays itself out. There's quite a bit of data that suggests that yes, some activity around the legislature is more active. There's different facets to it though. There's legislation where you can see different kind of patterns of what's happening, of whether it's more legislation or the time that it takes to go through, or what kind of level of scrutiny. And there's all sorts of different ways that you can look at that. I think the areas where it's most interesting where our legislature, i.e. not just the bit that's writing bills and acts and so forth, also the bits that's scrutinising what the government, what the civil service are up to, where that's more active, you see a lot more about the role of the backbencher. And I think Philip Cowley's work around backbenchers and revolts and so forth is really interesting around that. I also think Meg Russell's work on the House of Lords and the impact of Parliament more generally is really interesting, because she's looked at not only the data but also talked to people about what impact Parliament has. And one of the most fascinating things is that Parliament can often have an impact on governments just through the worry about what kind of scrutiny will happen, how legislation might be amended. So government will do a lot of things before it's even got to Parliament because it's worried about what kind of impact it will have. And those kind of subtle behaviours are really, really important to how politics happens, how policy is made. So beyond just looking at the sort of more overt things that we can pinpoint and count and so forth, we also need to understand those subtleties of things that are going on. So the way in which our constitution works and the role of the Prime Minister is really, really intriguing. It's not at all surprising that so many people like to study it. It's true that the powers, the formal powers that the Prime Minister has are not great, but the ones that they do have are really, really important, and a lot of informal powers flow from that. The greatest of them is obviously the ability to hire and fire ministers. And we've seen sort of the upsides and the downsides of that recently, because your power amongst your colleagues, your ability to persuade them, the feeling of power that you have within the party obviously has a big impact on how much you think you can sack people, bring in new people, sort of develop support amongst your ministers to try and get your kinds of policies through. So those informal powers are really, really important, but there's also a lot in terms of how the machine is fixed up to serve a Prime Minister. So even though they are first amongst equals, the power of number 10 to other departments is really, really quite significant. It's the thing that drives a lot of the machine of the civil service. It's a lot of the operation of how we develop policy involves a kind of check that number 10 might make on it all. I think it's both a help and a hindrance to talk about the presidentialism of Prime Ministers. It's not at all like the President, in as much as the Prime Minister is a part of the legislature in a way that US presidents are not. The powers, the resources that a UK Prime Minister has are far less than a US President, and their way in which they use executive powers is very different as well. The reason why people find it useful is to talk about the kind of the personality of the Prime Minister, and whether or not, in a general election, people are voting for that one person rather than their local MP or even the party that they represent. There are, issues about whether or not policy and the media is very much focused upon the Prime Minister as a key figure. So I think those ways are really useful. I think it is fair enough to say that the role of the UK Prime Minister is not just as the head of a very collegiate cabinet. It varies by the personality of the Prime Minister. We've seen some who are much more sort of strong figures, Tony Blair, Margaret Thatcher, but at the same time they're often tempered by their cabinet. Tony Blair was very restrained in terms of his relationships with his Chancellor. There were battles throughout their period in office together. Margaret Thatcher was obviously famously brought down by her cabinet. So there are limits to the degree to which we should try to compare the two. It's helpful, but it's also slightly misleading.